Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. I have the great pleasure of welcoming back Michael Tsarion to the channel. And today we're going to be talking about sacred prostitution.
That's right. Thank you so much for this opportunity. We had spoken earlier about the work of the great John Allegro, and his work didn't just touch on the mushroom cult. We were compressing, trying to make the highlights for people there, but his work was quite encompassing. He wrote about Jewish history in general, always adding in, if people go to my astrotheologyzone.com site, they'll see a page on John Allegro, and that just features just one of his books. Then you gave me the opportunity to dive into the more controversial. So it's a really good thing to follow up, because there's another aspect that he spoke of, and again, he wasn't the first, which is this temple prostitution. Now, I make this a huge part of my program, Female Illuminati. You can get the link by going to the femaleilluminati.com site. You'll be able to get the link there through to the program, which is really on Unslaved. So if anybody's listening who's already a member of Unslaved, just type in Female Illuminati program and you'll get this mammoth. It was about 9 hours in the filming, but edited it down to about 7 hours. That goes in heavily. I mean, today we can only touch on, this is a vast subject, really vast, probably in its own way, almost as deep as the story of the stellar cult. And anyway, there's connections anyway, and almost as vast and complex as the story of catastrophism, because women have an enormous role in that. I go into that in a two-part, again, mammoth series on Unslaved called The Monstrous Feminine, and go into histories of which even this, what we're talking about today, is going to be a branch of the whole bizarrity of woman and her role. In your show, we touch on the sacerdotal aspect, because look at even the major arcana of the tarot. Look at the various temple sites. I mean, the very gates of a temple are shaped like the yoni. Circe gives Kirk, which gives church. What? All portals of any temple, I don't care where they were and how old they were always dedicated to the goddess. In Egypt, their Nephthys, the sister of Isis, is the goddess of gateways and portals. So this story, as it unfolds, is absolutely, so there's no way that one program we could get in. In this one, though, we'll touch on, last time it was very important, we did that one first, because there I was able to touch on the influences, Assyrian, Persian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, and even Roman. Judaism is indeed the foundation of Christianity. No matter how many people spit teeth at that fact, it's the case. You also have other influences brought with them by Idiomites, Samaritans, Nabateans, all sorts of different Eastern groups that most of us don't even know played a part. And that's where these female cults also come in. So it's a very big story to get into what we're doing. I've tried to do justice to it on the astrotheology side as well. You'll find, information on temple prostitution, but mostly it's the Female Illuminati program that we go into. A lot of that. Now, of course, your viewers have heard of monotheism, and obviously that monotheism came out of polytheism, the worship of many gods. This is where the Judaism comes in. As we get down to the Christian era and post-Constantine, obviously the whole thing is redacted, Christianity, to look monotheistic. And to tell you the truth, they didn't really do a very good job. I mean, that whole nativity story and, many other things are all to be found in the cult of Mithra and what have you, right? But nevertheless, it was a shaving down to try and make it look like that. But you have this polytheism that was still operative in the Levant, that's the Middle East. And you had the breakaway sects of Judaism, which we mentioned last time. So it's not just, Christianity is based on Judaism, influence of Judaism, definitely there. Yeah, but there was 50 forms of Judaism when you break it down. Then they had this thing, henotheism. Because in all of these peoples we're talking about, not just Jews, there was favoritism about which god from the many that you picked importantly. Ra, for instance, was a public god. Amen-Ra was the god of the public. That didn't mean that the boss hogs, the kings and the lords and all of that, the priestesses and whatever, worshipped Amen-Ra in the same way that the people did. That was a people's god. So you can already dive into, say, Persia, dive into Egypt, whatever, and you can discern that there was the public gods and the private gods. And it's no different with Christianity today. There are privately worshipped gods that Christians don't know anything about. And there's private gods that Jews don't know anything about. So henotheism was this idea of picking favorites. And you could do it right down to the house, a particular dynasty, or even a particular private house. And certainly when it came to the house of Caesar and the house of a priestess, they had their private worship, private altars, private shrines. You know, so it's like a marquee out front. Oh yeah, we worship the great Amen-Ra, king of the gods. And he may be a solar deity. But at home inside, we might be worshiping Min. We might be worshiping Hathor. Khonsu. Ever heard of Khonsu? Ever heard of Anubis? And the young Horus and the old Horus, and, you know, Tem and Tum, and a host of others. They had an Ennead, 9 cosmic gods. So when you even study later forms of Christianity, this Celtic church with all of its odd saints that turn up that never existed. These are the saints that are taken from the old pagan world. Dennis, Saint Dennis. Saint Dennis is, I worship old Saint Dennis, is marvelous, you know. And Saint Bridget. We're all big fans of Saint Bridget, you know. They're all pagan god. Dennis is Dionysus. I mean, how you've An was the great goddess of the Celts, the sky goddess. Bridget is bride. You know, Saint Bride is the Catholic version, and that's Bridget, for goodness sake, supreme goddess of the ancient Celts, you know. And they were all in factions. I can name at least 5 different factions in Ireland, you know, and that's being that's abbreviating. It's actually a study to go through Western Europe, this includes France, and pick up all the saints that never existed, these Saint Columba and the Saint whatever. And myth-mongering is exposed, as it was for me, you know, back in my teens with all of this. Not that I knew what the hell it was all about. But this is the whole process of henotheism, in which it's Mithra now, but it was some other guy before that, you know, or there was a morphing. It would have been a slight morphing. And also morphing from almost an animal god, a god that literally was of more to do with the animal kingdom, you know, morphed into more of an anthropic, I mean, humanized look. This also has happened down through time. So so you see how vast this is. And so the Allegros and all, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at a vast canon, you know, and asking themselves, well, how are Mandeans and Therapeutai different from the Essenes? You know, and all of these different sects of the ancient world. But when we talk about this feature that he also grasped, not just the mushroom taking, the cult of, and we tried to do a fairly decent introductory sketch on that last time, but say you could go back to the Atrahasis. You can go back to the Enuma Elish of the Babylons, thousands of years before the Bible was written, thousands of years before Judaism was even known. You know, you get your Canaanites, your Phoenician Canaanites, you got the Sumerians, you've got the old Egyptians of the older dynasties. And you can go back to the very famous, people haven't heard, it's one of the earliest myths in the world, Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a prostitute, Shamat, who's, they've got a monkey man, they've got a primitive in there, and the Pasophoy, the animal man, they can't remember exact details. I think Gilgamesh himself sends, you know, he wants to win the favor of this Enkidnu, jungle man of the forest or whatever. He sends him a temple prostitute. Everyone knows, look up prostitution online. Prostitution is the oldest profession in the world. Well, that's polite. It's the oldest criminal profession in the world, and it gave rise to many other forms of crime. Because the man, in order to have sexual liaison, becomes a robber, a thief, a burglar, a blagger, a extortioner, right from the white collar level up. All sorts of secondary derivative crimes start to plague our society. Embezzlement, for instance. All of that comes online because of access to prostitutes. Who do you think will ever tell you that? It's so controversial. And this subject is, of course, controversial, to know that it goes back. Oh, just a point about those two books I mentioned, Asherah, the Enuma Elish, the old Babylonian and Assyrian works. Also talk, of course, about the Anunnaki. And that word implies serpent or snake. So what are we going to do now? You got more hours to go into that branch? But the equivalence of this serpent and the woman, which we think begins in Genesis, no, it doesn't. It originates with these earlier documents. Actually, it goes even before them. Those documents are already late telling of the serpent queen. But what on earth are these two symbols even doing together? I think it's in where was it? Etruscans, maybe. Their chief goddess holds a snake by the head. You know, the serpent goddess. I mean, it just goes on and on. Like I say, we don't have time to go into it. But the one thing that comes out of those earlier books, and those are prototypes of Genesis, by the way, get that right. And there's even a Nordic prototype of exactly the Garden of Eden scene. There's a Turkish one, which I think is one of the most fascinating. I'll get to a little bit of an anecdote about that in a minute. But these modern scholars, at least, that's why we should talk about it, do acknowledge the origins, the antitype of the biblical Genesis story, right, is in Babylon, Sumeria, and even Acadia, right? Okay, but then those stories tell you something quite interesting, and that is that the gods who might be represented by that serpent, you know, anyway, the serpent knowledge could be Anki, you know, from heaven, the Anunnaki. Well, they want to mate with the women, and they want to mate. And those books not just describe that, which is bizarre enough, they give you the reason why. There's a deep need of the gods to have their seed merge with humanity. Although, you know, we should redefine what humanity was. It wasn't anything we know exactly as we know it today, but let's just keep it simple. And vice versa, humans, the women, the ones that became these sacerdotal priestesses, wanted actively, willfully, to have the seed of the god within their bodies. Within, you know, they wanted these special solar children. These early books are telling you this. How come our culture is not based in it? It would help. You'd understand a lot of the idioms with that immaculate conception that happened and other things that, you know, later on in life, we'd understand them more. And, you know, your channel is excellent because we're getting into that. Whoever would have thought what baptism is, you know, and all that we exposed last time. I mean, whoever would ever tell you that, you know, what's really behind all of that. So there was this connection between the man and the gods. And so it's not to be conceived of or, you know, configured as some sort of imposition. That probably was part of it. But there was a need for the gods to actually blend with humanity and vice versa. Now, one reason, of course, which is also documented in those works, those ancient texts, is slavery, enslavement. The gods needed rest, as it's euphemistically put. And so they had their slaves, you know. But that creature, the Eve, that we know from the Genesis story, that opens vast doors. Because in these earlier books, see, think of it. The word itself, Hava, or Hawa, or Awa, right? You can take off the H, meant serpent in Arabic. Hebrew too. In Egypt, the hieroglyph for a woman was a serpent. There we are again. The Hurrians, you can look them up. It's just a word for Aryan. The Hurrian people, very important people of the Middle East. They had a goddess who's called the life giver, Hibat. And even though it may not sound like it, Ibat, Iva, B and V were often interchangeable. So Hibat or Ibat is Eva. So when you look in these different cultures, you find this Eve already. as the mother of the gods. She was called the life giver. It's extraordinary when you get into it. And the serpent was always her symbol. And that alone is a mythograph that must be explained. And you don't have to do any science fiction, because, as I said, in these early texts, they're telling you what it means. Secret knowledge, special knowledge, you know. And often in the earliest dynasties, this goddess was a dyad. There were two of them, just like we know from Isis and Nephthys. And in some of the Enneads, you get this. But the greatest pairing of all, and then I go into this in my Trees of Life book, it's hugely about these two goddesses, Wadjet and Nekhbet. So when you see the pharaoh wearing the two symbols, you usually see the cobra, serpent, again, that's a female symbol. So just realize that the kings of Egypt are wearing a female symbol on their forehead. That's what that serpent really represents, the cobra goddess. And sometimes you see beside that diadem is a vulture head. Well, the cobra goddess and the vulture goddess are Wadjet and Nekhbet. You could write books on those two alone, and I have. These are two serpent goddesses. As time went by, they were the goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. You know, there's many permutations. The very crown that the pharaoh wore would sometimes be a dual crown to represent these two goddesses. They had their own colors. The Queen of England recently died. Go back to the stuff I've done on her coronation, and you'll find out that the symbols of these ancient goddesses were in the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I. They gave rise to a very important sect. So important that there's really no other more important sect that has ever been. And they were called the Great Royal Wives. It's a matriarchal gynocratic sect that grew up in Egypt in the earliest dynasties under these two goddesses. And it was members of the Great Royal Wives, this order, that made a lord, a king, into a pharaoh. And without their approval, he didn't become pharaoh. Not only their approval, he had to marry somebody from their sect. So Nefertiti, I'm just saying the ones that everybody's heard, was not a member of the Great Royal Wives. A pharaoh could definitely marry a second wife or whatever. Sitamun, his first wife, was. So Akhenaten becomes pharaoh. And so it was from time immemorial. You could have secondary wives, you know, Solomon and his concubines. Well, the concubines are not wives. He had 500 wives and 300 concubines. What's the difference? Yeah, we'll get to that. But the thing is, this group that I'm talking about is known in the occult world, or at least I've added it in my work because it was misnamed. They are the dragon court. Well, of course, I've just described that at least one of the goddesses that they worshipped was a serpent goddess, the primordial serpent goddess, Wadjet. And this group has lasted for thousands of years. You know, the Great Royal Wives, the Dragon Court, the Sisterhood, the Female Illuminati, whatever you want to call it. It has morphed. It's gone through enormous changes down through history, but it hasn't ultimately gone anywhere. In fact, they remain in control today. I know that's very controversial, but there you are. That's what my work tries to prove. So the Garden of Eden story that suddenly features a woman, and a serpent and a tree. These symbols were known across the world, right, going into Egypt. But the difference is that in those days, they knew what the fruit of the tree represented. We now know from last week with John Allegro. It was some sort of mushroom. But the mushroom was stylized as a pomegranate or an apple or even an orange. See, the golden apples of the tree of Hesperides in the Greek myth, because they butchered a lot of things. I know some of your other guests won't like this, but it's a fact. Well, they were just golden apples. They were just oranges, actually, because the orange was sacred to the goddess and all of that, right? And in that Turkish story, and what I mean is Turkey's Anatolia. It was a Western country with these Hurrians and these Hittites. It was a Hittite empire. But not just there. Even in these ones from elsewhere, the garden was strictly the precinct of the woman, of the priestess. And the male, this Adam creature, was the violator of her precinct. So think of Genesis, right? The garden is not of Jehovah, but of Asherah. of Astarte, of Ashtaroth, of Semiramis, and the Aryan versions in the West. And the eating of the apple was some bugger breaking into the garden, breaking the laws, the divine laws of the goddess, and stealing her fruit. And after you eat the fruit, you could be talking to God, you'd be talking to anything. So the violation is this of the worker class, the Adamites, right? Getting in where they didn't belong is one of the antitypes. Therefore, Genesis then already is an inversion, which doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense. Who's this Lilith? Satan isn't even mentioned as being equivalent with the serpent, and so on, so on, so on. And just the simple iconography that does exist within the story of these trees that are suddenly pop up as mythographs and then quickly dropped in the Bible, and they're hardly ever mentioned again throughout the whole of the corpus. And as a matter of fact, there's another story that says that the goddess objected to the violation because sacred herbs had been taken. Look, why do you think we had to start with John? Sacred herbs. Well, let's think what that might be. The goddess, as we said last time, is the keeper. Her sacerdotal status is she's the keeper of how to mix the soma, the elixir of life, that carried on right down through the Gnostic tradition and other traditions. So much so that these Judite breakaway sects wanted to go back to these pagan ways and did. The Sanhedrin went apeshit. And John Allegro read it and found out about it, told it to the world, and look what happened to him. So the sacred herbs of the goddess, yeah, okay. So before it was scrubbed from the Old Testament, scholars, the priestly patriarchal types, took the story of Asherah out. She's still in there, as I said last time, in terms of symbolism. The garden, the mountain, the hill, the Bethel, the standing stone, the tree of life, the serpent, as we just said, the burning bush, as we just said, all of that. And surrogate symbols. Did you know that the golden calf is one of her symbols? Because it's a symbol of her child, her son. So she's God's wife, but she was center. She was the controller. She was superior to Yahweh. You wouldn't believe the nonsense that went on during the redactions, from way back centuries BC up until the Common Era, right? Major change in the power structure. Your Hezekiahs and that type, we're changing the status quo, going through an enormous schism in which this pagan feminine aspects were being thrown out. So what we're talking about here is, take off the lid, and there's a whole mythos of this. It goes on incredibly, but men subsumed control. And then I'm not one of those people who believe that they did it for no reason, or they did it from some, like the modern feminists are telling you, they did it through violence only. There are my work goes into the reasons why this power shift took place, especially in religion. But mostly it was just because of it was depraved. Descriptions talk about the temples just before Judaism, just before the big temple was opened, and even at the time of the Great Temple, the steps, and the surrounds were just filled with temple prostitutes, and these were official. They weren't seducing anybody illegally. This was part of Judaism, as it was part of early Christianity, as it was part of the later Roman Empire. You can get into the whole story of it, right? And later on, even the Vestal virgins, they didn't just keep the sacred fire brought from the east to Rome. It was a little bit more than that. But they had all of these temple prostitutes, and things got complicated because these beings, these women, were referred to as virgins, paradoxically. But back in those early texts, it was a case of lesser gods. They were known as the Igigi, who were made to serve the higher gods, the Anunnaki. They started to slip up, and they even made the mistake of trying to rebel. So fiery goddesses were sent out. They struck back. The Anunnaki did, wiped out the Igigi. They took their leader, they drained his blood, they mashed him up, and they used his remains to create a new group. What were they called? The Nisu or something like that. I can't quite remember, right? They created a second race. I think it was the Nisu, to serve them, right? To take the place of these more rebellious. They were called the Lulu. That's what I was looking for. The Lulu were the ones who were wiped out. Their king, who had started these revolutionary actions against the gods, the Anunnaki, was destroyed by Enki, who's also known as Ea in other traditions, and Nin-Ti. And you can put a little hyphen, Nin-Ti, Lady of the Rib. Nin-Hershag is another one of her names. And I get into all of this, right? So they mashed him up and took his blood, and out of that concoction made a new race. And they were the Lulu. That's it. So the Igigi leader was killed. The Lulu were created. They don't serve the gods either. I'm trying to get this right. They don't serve the gods very well either, the Lulu, and they get sort of wiped out. But the gods had realized that every time they make one of these, just call them the Adamic peoples, they're very rebellious and they don't really work very well. They don't give us our rest. So by the time that the Lulu are being created to replace the Igigi, the gods wipe them out and cull the herd by plagues and other means, all right? Plagues. And so the Lulu are kept under control by this culling method. And then when they finally get out of order, those ancient texts, like the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish, speak of great flood. Well, we heard that one before. Right. It turns up again in Genesis, but it's not Christian and it's not Jewish. Now, the humans, obviously, we're talking about the Adamites, Adamu. They're not completely destroyed, obviously, because the gods need to be served. All that needs to happen is that the rebellious spirit in them needs to be killed off every now and again. And this has happened twice, as the texts say, and possibly even more than that. And the last of the races is the Nisu. That's us. So by the time you get to Genesis, it's a right mix-up. One story is that they just nicked that from some female mythos about the garden of the goddess, the green goddess, the great serpent queen. And you do have it also in the Greeks. Before the time of Olympus, see, Olympus, the gods of Olympus are much late. Eurynome, E-U-R, Eurynome, was a serpent queen who ruled Olympus with her consort. But in those early primeval days, a consort, that's a mate or a male figure, is cast in two roles. One is as husband / son lover. In fact, it's the same thing in Egypt with Osiris. He's called the husband of the mother. What? And there's this other, motifs about giving birth to oneself. And this is the case with Eurynome. She gives birth to a male child who then becomes her husband, her consort, her mate. And then they give birth to another child who's the serpent child. So Eurynome is a goddess that was there on Olympus in the earliest days of the Greeks. And it, connects to the earlier Proto-Greeks. Because is she not Eri of Ireland? Eurynome, Ure, is not Eriu? Erin is Northern Ireland. Eriu is Ira is Southern Ireland. But they're both goddess names. The primordial serpent goddess. The phoneme is Western. No question about it. As I said, her mate is called Ophion. Precisely because that O-P-H, as you find in Orphites, we talked about them before, is serpent, the serpent god. But he is really subservient to Eri, the green one. And Eri, just before I forget, is the word root in Ireland of Ari. She's also known with an A, Ari, vowels change. And Ari is aristocracy. Aristocracy. Arya is Aryan. Ireland in Iran have that word root, the homes of the Arya. Well, how far is Iran from Turkey that we're talking about? So this is the Aryan race, when you know what you're talking about, when you know what that word really means. And when you really know what it means, actually, it's not a race. It's a caste, a spiritual sacerdotal caste, of which women were involved, of which Africans were involved. It was worldwide. Scythians were involved, Persians were involved. The Aryan race has been totally misrepresented to us for reasons we should be now becoming more familiar with. And of course, as a race or a caste, they have their own mythos. So when I go through all of these world's mythoses, I'm looking for these motifs that are Aryan, in the sense that this is like the word root I just mentioned, and other tree symbolism and all of this, so that you then, can find it. Half the Christian ritual we know, the Christmas ritual, is Aryan. You see, so it's picking it out. Why was Moses even shown with, a blonde beard and white hair and all of this we can get into? And she lived on Mount Olympus because that is one of the goddess's tutelary symbols, is a mountain. And in Nordic countries, you have Idun, right? A goddess from DN, Dun, which is abundance. So she's the goddess of the garden. She's the goddess of abundance. She's the goddess of the serpent. Not Hebrew, not Jewish. And the fruit of her tree, Eden, is a goddess that also had a fruit. It's not an apple. It's a mushroom. So the fruits, be the same with hell or any of them. The goddess, you've seen the Persephone holding the pomegranate. It's a euphemism for something, for some hallucinogenic potions in which pomegranate juice. But you had menses, you had semen, you had serpent venom, you had psilocybin, you had the amanita, you had baby's blood, if you really want to get into it, right? All the nice stuff. Even in Babylon, but long before the Christians ever existed, wealthy women from wealthy homes were obligated, right? Get this, obligated to become a temple prostitute and at least to sleep and seduce with one man. But of course, we know that's minimizing it. No, the rich women all had to serve. It's like, well, I have to go and join the army for 2 years. No, these women were seduced into being temple prostitutes. That was early religion. They became, acolytes of the temple of Aphrodite, and sexual goings on was part of the gig. Religion and sex cannot be separated. But then when it gets to the Phoenician Canaanites and the Hebrews, the early Jews, men are also involved. That's where the sodomite idea comes from. Kadosh or Kedesh is their name, and the Kedeshah are the women. And you can see 2 Kings 23, verse 7, right? That would be a place to go to prove that. A lot of texts were purged. Later on, when the goddess cults wanted to be completely purged by the patriarchs, a lot of references that might have been there were also burned and just taken out later on as a great purge took place. And as I said, but child sacrifice is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah 32 and also 2 Kings 23. You'll actually read about child sacrifice and weird altars, and this was happening in Jerusalem. So even from the little bit left, we've got tree worship, we've got prostitution on Temple Mount, we've got child sacrifices to the god Es, Moloch. They found origins of that in the Canaanite again, the Phoenician Canaanite, but I've always maintained that the owl symbol of Moloch is a goddess, and I've also emphasized that, you see, this is not considered barbaric in those days because the goddess, look at the seeds of a pomegranate. She sees all humanity as seeds from her womb. And the birth giver and the giver of life can also take life back. You come out of my womb and I can have you return to me, as long as it's ritualistic, sacrifice. And there's nothing bizarre about it. The teeming womb can take back into itself death. right? And many famous early Roman and Greek historians, and even Jewish ones. Livy was a Jewish one. The two Livys, there was actually two brothers who were historians. These people openly spoke in their writings. These historians of antiquity spoke of child sacrifice. They also speak of to Kronos, turns up, Kronos, sort of an early reaper. But we know from my work that Kronos, Crom, Saturn, they're all euphemisms for the comet. So these sacrifices were to prevent some disaster like a cometary action from happening again. That's sacrifice to the great god of the serpent in the sky, the fiery one. In Hosea, book of Hosea, chapter 4, you'll hear about this as well. In there, it talks more about grove worship. Talks about trees and wooden little votives, little altars. And when you look at the design of a church with educated eyes, you're still seeing a grove. All the columns inside, and I went into great detail on that in Trees of Life book to show you the inside of very famous cathedrals and churches are styled, not just like trees, but even like mushrooms. We went into that. But Deuteronomy 16, at this point, you start to get the prohibitions are being put in place, and there's more evidence of the rivalries that are opening up, and of course, when there's rivalry, the female groups go underground. And if they take their eunuchs with them, the castrati, the Galli, as they were called, again, female Illuminati program goes into detail. Those characters used to wear a cross around their necks. They were cross dressers anyway. But the cross was made of four penises come together. They found images of this, and women would wear it. And so whenever you see an early pagan god with what looks like a swastika or a double cross, right? These were phallic symbols. The cross was phallic. It was worn for good luck. So these Kadeshites, or the Kadesh. Now, it turns out that Kadesh is very similar to Kadosh, and Kadosh is a goddess, just to even further cement the idea. And, there's etymology to do with the letter Q. We won't get into. So K, the sound of K and the sound of Q represented these temple prostitutes. King Solomon, as we said earlier on, 300 concubines, not wives. It doesn't make a bit of sense. 300 of them? And the Bible tells you that it was in 1 Kings 11, they tell you that they're the most beautiful in the land. He's literally combing through all the beauties of the land and making them either wives or concubines. And of course, he was very tolerant toward them. The concubines, letting them light incense to their goddesses. And the local priests are hopping mad over this, because he's allowing them to light incense and make sacrifices to their cultic idols. Well, who are they? So as when I said last time, it's in the Bible, but you pass by. This is a cult of priestesses with some very bizarre sexual rites, including the sacrifice of any children that are born to them. That's all right. We're just sending them back to the Great Mother. The temple itself, you can get descriptions of this from Jewish sources. Inside the Temple of Solomon, well, in fact, the whole architecture is born to look like, designed to look like coitus. But inside, all the drapes in the outer galleries and then in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, were sexual. They were orgiastic. Women used to sit there. Women were permitted to sit with large wall hangings and drapes and embroider them and weave these things. And they were all full of sexual, like Kama Sutra type images. And they would hang them up on the front of the Holy of Holies, folks. Side chambers in the Temple of Solomon were little cubicles where sodomites would ply their trade. For anybody walking in, any man walking in could have his sodomite experience in the Temple of Solomon, because phallic worship was just the order of the day. This was a cult of Asherah, and the temple featured not just the worship of Yahweh. They featured the Holy of Holies. It's Asherah all the way. The burning bush that Moses goes to, Jehovah is a secondary figure here. Jehovah and Yahweh are worshipped in the Temple of Solomon, not as primary tutelary deities, but as sons of the goddess whose temple, Circe, church, comes from Circe, Holy Mother Church. Then we meet later in the New Testament, Mary Magdalene, Lady of the Tower, meaning, again, the same thing, the temple. And she is described immediately as a harlot. Well, now we know what harlot means. It's temple prostitute, hanging around Jesus. The 12 disciples nearly go ape shit. What's this woman doing from this cult? We don't want one of her. We go, well, you're going to have her, says Jesus. And the scholars have now discovered that they were married. Well, didn't Moses marry this woman called Zipporah that he met one day at a well in the middle of nowhere? Who's this Zipporah, this little bird? But in the case of Mary Magdalene, the artist show her with red hair. That's not insignificant. Dig out what your Ralph Ellis's have to say about them. They're not temple prostitutes only. Try more like priestess, queen. And you'll always see medieval pictures and Renaissance pictures of Mary with a skull nearby her. She's described then later as the anointer of Jesus with this costly spikenard. Well, anybody who's done 5 minutes of homework knows again that when you're dealing with the herbs of the goddess, spikenard being a plant herb, it's a euphemism for the drugs, the drug cult. And the anointing is a classic priestess role going back to the dawn of time. And the anointing of the king, like I said, to make him into Pharaoh, the anointing of the Pharaoh is exactly phallic with the chrism. So Jesus Christ is chrism, the anointed one with this oil of sex. Like you can see in India today when the women anoint the lingam stone, the phallic lingam stone with milk and honey to represent semen. As I said, the mountain is the symbol of the goddess. The golden calf is the symbol of her son. So when the Israelites are waiting for Moses, get a bit bored, need to turn on Netflix, they do this merry dance and go all ape shit. Those are the agape feasts, folks. They weren't sitting around praying. They weren't sitting around cooking food. They weren't sitting around singing hymns. They were revelry around the great symbol of the phallic bull. But the phallic bull is a goddess symbol. All that cavorting, and the cavorting is sexual. Baal is the child of Asherah. Baal is called the hymen breaker. Try rapist, might be just as good. So all these gods, Priapus, Pan, Yahweh, they're all phallic. Yeah, and they meet on the high place or at in the little ditches below. The high place is her place, and the high priestess will take you. And they had all these torchlight all around at night where you could go, and they did, and that was the Bethel stone, the great phallic pillars that are mentioned all the way through the Old Testament. The story we have already mentioned before about I'm giving my testimony, we'd say today. Well, that was usually with your hand on your penis or your balls, right? In ancient times. I'm giving my testimony to the goddess, and I'll risk losing my, phallus over it. That's not swearing to a god. The Old Testament is full of the polygamy. We've said about Solomon, but Moses did it too, and that had to be a little bit stamped, expunged. But we know it didn't stop. Ancient art throughout the Levant and the Far East and even in the West shows you the yoni, right? One could talk endlessly about that, and the phallus together as a symbol. You get called the Shil Nagig in the West. Well, that's Asherah and Jehovah, or Asherah and Baal, because when Baal is born, I told you he's not just the son. He's not just the son of the goddess that bore him. He's the son lover to be husband. This is how the ancient mind looked at it. Look at 1 Kings 11. Look at the book of Exodus. Oh, in fact, it's in the book of Exodus that you get the story of Moses wandering in the desert, comes across these Midianites, whoever the hell they are, and meets Zipporah, a beautiful woman, and her 7 sisters. 7 sisters by a well. That's not astrotheological. See, the well was the whole of the night sky, and the central star, the central pole star, was the bottom of the well. It was the great cauldron, it was the great grail, and the 7 sisters who dance around it were the 7 stations of the pole. In fact, they couldn't even get her father's name right. In one book, one rendering, he's called Jethro, and in another one is Ruel, the biblical mythmongers, because it wasn't important. It was the mythography that they were alluding to, that this Zipporah is an initiation in the desert. The desert was always known, in Persian mythology as the place of initiation. So that's why they all did it. Abraham, Joseph, Jesus, John the Baptist, the hero of the saga, is always crossing the desert. That means initiation. Jesus goes out to meet Satan in the wilderness. John the Baptist is always in the wilderness, right? Abraham crossed the wilderness. Joseph, right? The wilderness is an initiation story, but it's often in terms of a female bunch of rites. So in this story of Moses literally meeting the priestess Zipporah by the well and her 7 dancing sisters is purely astrotheological, for those who can understand it. But that little anecdote that they danced for him introduces this other orgiastic element as well. That's why you have to decode these stories. This shows that this was probably one of these temple prostitutes, is now a part of the story. Then the more controversial aspects is this is where we get circumcision. It's actually where we get the whole rites of castration. Now that part has been expunged, and that's why you need to know who to read, these John Allegros, these various people, to understand that castration, the Galli, the eunuchs who served the goddess, and later monks, would have their head shaved and whatnot to represent the same thing. Masonry is full of this, and I mean really full of it, are parts of the goddess cult. So the chalice with wine in it, blood, right, is a female symbolism. Just as it is the anointing rites that we've just spoken of with the chrism, which is where we get the word Christ. Mass, Sunday Mass, or whatever the hell it is from mess. That's Egyptian for the little cakes for these feasts. They had some pretty bizarre ingredients, and then it turns up in Messiah again, anointed one. Same meaning but different word roots. And then, as I said, the lingam in India, Shiva's phallus, women pouring ghee, butter, and milk over it. I wonder what that represents then. So wherever you find the story of the goddess, right, the mother goddess, Rhea, Cybele, Semiramis, Aphrodite, Venus, as I said, the Western versions, she's depraved. She wants sacrifices. She's the queen of heaven, the giver of all life. So later castration became just circumcision, a little ringlet instead of the whole thing. And again, the bizarrity of it, the paradox, virgin didn't mean in those days what it means today. That was one that was dedicated to the goddess. You see this every time you drive to work, when you pass by a city square. They're often not squares, they're big, big circles. And then in the middle, you've got this giant clock tower or column. Goddess first, phallic god later, phallic principle later. And it's in her lap. She is the controller of the phallic principle. And when you see the monkeys out on the streets, smashing windows and revelry in the city square, nothing new there. Right? The sodomites are out again, and the anarchists. What's new? The revelry, the drug taking. It's all sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Holy Spirit is feminine. Well, Mike, I read it, but I don't see any of the stuff you're talking about. It's meant to be in there. Well, it is. The Holy Spirit is relating to the goddess cults. Aphrodite, Semiramis, the list goes on. Astarte, Ashtaroth, Rhea, and Cybele. We get the word Kabbalah from her name, Cybele. Like that bell that's up there in the church towers. They believed in the yoni and the phallus, the semen and the menses must be merged together. It has spiritual properties. You combine it with all these ethnogens. These are the herbs of the goddess and her garden. You keep the herbs in a garden, so don't violate the garden. And then the most important part that connects to the other subject we deal with, astrotheology, is that when you make these concoctions and imbibe them, it has to be at important astrological times. Conjunctions that we don't even know about today. We can just guess, oh, the equinoxes and the solstice? Yeah, but what about Virgo? What about asteroids? You wouldn't be believing what's going on. It's still going on today, by the way. What about the 13th sign? This odd sign. And on we can go with that. But nevertheless, the movement of Venus, the movement of Mercury, you see, there's different conjunctions, different periods of the solar year, and even the lunar, because later on they're going to symbolize all of what I'm talking about by, lunar symbols on products and Venusian symbols and all sorts of things. You have to, sort of decode it, right? But we're dealing here with a Venus cult, and they will definitely embody lunar symbolism, whatever, number symbolism, like 13 and 7. So it's all very, very controversial. Some of it has been proven. So, we try to galvanize that work by the John Allegros of the world, and Professor Thompson and Ralph Patai and others have exposed a lot of this. But of course, it gets even more controversial if you say, like what I do, that these ancient female cults are still around, running Hollywood. These would be descendants of the great royal wives. Their order morphed a great deal, especially after the time of Akhenaten. And Masonry, what we know as esoteric Masonry, as well as Templarism, have preserved these rites. There's female Masonry. There's the Order of Eve, the Order of Rebecca, the Order of the Eastern Star. Scottish Rite, if you only knew what that really refers to. It's actually the name of a woman, amazingly, right? So we can leave it there, but the thing is, it hasn't gone away. Therefore, right in the world that we live in today, when you see all of these different Beyoncés and Lady Gagas and Madonnas, and you see all of this imagery that they're using, surrounded by a bunch of male eunuchs dancing, and then the very symbolism and the obscene lyrics and the obscene symbolism, and these Abramoviches, and it's still there in our society, but we're just cognitively unaware of it. We're not thinking in terms of that this depraved revelry is that ancient. And as I said, the need for the blood of the gods to merge ritualistically with lower forms and vice versa. So a big story there. And if you want people really interested in this, just go. There's a lot on temple prostitution on the Astrotheology Zone site. But if they really want the heavy duty aspect of it, we've done it in the Female Illuminati site and the Female Illuminati program. And, maybe even more to say about this down the line. But again, esoteric, thank you so much for this opportunity to get into this incredible subject.
You mentioned Solomon and you mentioned Mary, and there were two other characters that in reading about them in the Bible always confused me. So you have the prophet Hosea, who God approved of him marrying a prostitute. And you have the story of Judah and Tamar, where Judah slept with his daughter-in-law, effectively, who pretended to be a prostitute. And there were no repercussions at all for him. Can you elaborate a bit on those stories?
Oh, yeah. See, in the olden days, right, women of the house were, like we've just alluded to, could easily go and become one of these temple prostitutes. In fact, in Babylon, remember we talked about the influences. The Hebrews are getting all of this possibly from other races. And so even in your household, that whole story about Hamar, back in the beginning with Abraham, 2 wives, Sarah, the princess, and then the other one, right? You see, it's there, man. It's there. And this can If your wife couldn't bear a child, well, these temple prostitutes rent themselves out. Take one of our Vestal virgins, take one of our Heroduli, and get on with it. And that's a legitimized child. But the cult of Asherah was that important. And we've only touched on that. We haven't even spoken here of the Shekinah and the Matronit, two very important female divine presences in Judaism. We've been just keeping it, kind of as clear as we can. But you see, the temple prostitutes were taken out of these families. And so the story of these concubines is in these things. And Tamar is a very important one. Tamar is also, I think it's in either Arabic, might be in Hebrew, is identified as the name of the palm tree. Tall and slender. It was called beautiful and fruitful. And the little dates, I suppose they are, off of the palm tree were again fruits of the goddess, because Tamar is the goddess. Tamar is a beautiful woman. And the palm tree, which gave life to all of those lands, was considered the beautiful woman of the desert. And her succulent fruits, we consider dates. They knew, we don't mean that. We mean that this is, these other fruits. And this is open-ended. This is not something secret. There's deeper rites and rituals of it, but it was known throughout the world. Everybody was on this. In exactly the same way today, if you go to the East, for decades, they've been smoking hashish and what have you, right? And when you smoke hashish, right, you can have the assassins or hashish smokers, and they went around causing nightmare in Arabia. Yeah, like the zealots and the Sicarii, smoking the same stuff and taking even worse stuff, were a plague in Judea and ended up bringing the wrath of the most tolerant Romans down on their heads. Then they, as I said last time, they were pushed underground, and we have the black market in drugs from that time. And this is where the study leads you. The only thing is that the purveyors of the drugs are royal families of the world. These Khashoggis, these, what's his name? The Juan Carloses of Spain and all of this, right? The Esterhazys, people who know my work. These bloodlines of the Illuminati, whatever one you want to call them, these Prince Charleses, oh, he's king now, don't you know? So the thing is that these are opium dealers, opium being one of the, but not the only one. Opium became a euphemism for the drug dealing, and it became international when the British royal family and what is known as the British East India Company, and their colors of their flag are almost identical to the American flag, just to let you know, right? So this worldwide syndicate is opened the White House. They sit in the corridors of power. They almost tell you, because they have their own symbols, like the cornucopia would be one. They've got many symbols. They're quite unusual. So in my sites, you'll see a lot of stuff on symbolism, because I'm trying to show people, crack the symbolism of these cults. So then when you spot it, you know it, and then you know what you're dealing with. So it really gets, these Nestle's, oh my goodness, all the corporate stuff that reveals who these people are. The amount of biblical symbolism that's on everything, but it's right in plain view. This is the difficulty. But the Tamar, yeah, that is an extraordinary, because the prostitutes would also meet in groves, remember, under the apple tree, and one of the most famous Masonic venues way back when Masons changed their charter in England is called the Apple Tree Tavern. In America, it was called the Green Dragon Tavern. Okay, women and serpents and women, right? You see it in the architecture everywhere. And some of this is on Christian churches. Well, I don't think that serpents and gargoyles, when you're high, you'll be seeing some fucking gargoyles, all right. So they're laughing at us, man. They're laughing at us. A lot of the churches that we find all over the world, including France and Italy, are positioned right on temple prostitute sites. All that bizarre stuff you see, naked children, little cherubs, the pissing boy and all that you find in places like Florence and Venice, and all this weird architecture that all these tourists take photographs of. I have no idea, a fountain with water, a head of a lion with water coming out of it. What's the association, and on we could go. Even the very fact of a fountain, which we explained earlier, and these bizarre rites and all the rest of it. So So where the controversy comes in, what we ended with there was that when you see these Helen DeGeneres, Helen DeGeneres, right, and all of this, and these Oprah Winfrey's, and a lot of this stuff, I see the same symbolism. I'm not asking a single person to believe it, what I'm talking about, because a lot of it uses the misuse of light and all sorts of occult traditions. But you can have soft occultism to lure you in, right? The mugs get lured in. Mug means mugger. It's a Masonic term for those who have no clue. They're out in the marketplace. Mugger, the mugs. And they got many of other terms for, the stupid asses out there who you don't know what's going on. And then they can send their daughters, they can send their progeny out there in the rock and roll movement, in country and western, in advertising, in cosmetics, in all sorts of secular ways, fashion, cosmetics, Hollywood, and they have their symbols, right? You'll see that people wearing these symbols, all of these airheads, and we just think it's cool. We think it's trendy. We have no idea that's Tamar. That's the, and then the sodomite idea, or the cross-dresser idea, or the transsexual idea. It's as old as you can imagine. And so you can decode it when you look at these videos, these rock videos and pop videos as well. And then when sometimes you have these Jimmy Savile type exposés, right? So it's all very good and everything, but you wouldn't believe that's just a little pinprick of a vast underground cultism, a syndicate that applies in drugs, but wherever there's drugs, there's sex. You see, and wherever there's sex and drugs, then there's outer body experiences, and you have an element of religion involved in it. And you have also people, the people who oversee this. As I said, in a strange way, they don't see it as being very evil. This is the thing that we know it as evil, and it is. It's depraved. The patriarchs in the Bible also knew it was, so some of these judges and the prophets in the Old Testament tried to get rid of this. But they actually don't think of it as negative because they feel, being Gnostic. That's why I'm so anti-Gnostic in all areas of my work, right? Because they actually believe that these transportive, they're called telestic rites, mantic rites, are good for you. Well, we had it back in the 60s. I don't see much good come out of it, but they do believe that. And there's no shortage of androgynous, David Bowie, Mick Jagger, River Phoenix type guys, who they can find to be the people's champions. No end of it. No end of it. And the moment that you wake up as one of those people who's been chosen, but maybe you try to whistle blow, you're dead. So I look at a lot of different, nobody really gets the chance after being chosen for that to then go on later and try to expose it. So a Brian Jones, a Jim Morrison, Paul Kossoff, Jimi Hendrix. The list is quite long, and we got to wonder, about all of it. And some of the ritual aspects, of course, the red-headed women that may surround, or even blonde women that may surround some of these rock stars, famous people. What's that all about? So I go into the whole nightmare of it in my works to show you exactly what this. Age of Manipulation would be another one. That's a very lengthy program that I did in live, Age of Manipulation. But the Female Illuminati website would be a good place to start.
Michael Tsarion, thank you.
Thank you.